We have a number of seats over on this side over here. There's a row of about 5 or 6 seats on this end. There's some seats down here in the front. And I see some seats scattered through here as well. Why don't you have a seat? Sit right here. I'll give you a bit of an introduction, and we'll be ready to go. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jeff Brenzel. I'm the Dean of Undergraduate Admissions here at Yale and also the Master of Timothy Dwight College and a lecturer in the Philosophy Department. And I'm the steward of the Chubb Fellowship at Yale. And I want to tell you just a brief word about the fellowship. In 1949, a gift from Yale alumnus Hendon Chubb launched a speaking fellowship at Yale to promote the notion that service to the public good is the highest calling to which any citizen can aspire. To be named a Chubb Fellow is Yale's most notable honor accorded to a visiting speaker. Chubb Fellows have included many heads of state and national leaders, Nobel and Pulitzer Prize winners, and a wide range of other highly accomplished individuals in political affairs, nonprofit and for-profit governance, the literary and fine arts, whose experiences and leadership have helped define the challenges of our times and the ways that we should seek to address them. Before I introduce this spring's Chubb Fellowship recipient, President Leonel Fernandez, I want to take a moment to recognize another prominent citizen of the Dominican Republic who has traveled from Washington to be with us, our special guest, the current ambassador of the Dominican Republic to the United States, Anibal de Castro. Anibal de Castro. Before his government service, Ambassador de Castro was a noted Dominican journalist, ultimately serving as editor-in-chief of Ultima Hora, then as director of the newspaper. He also co-founded Editorial AA, publisher of the groundbreaking socio-political magazine Rumbo. From 2000 until his appointment in 2004 as ambassador of the Dominican Republic to the United Kingdom, he directed the newspaper Diario Libre. After serving for 6 years as ambassador from the Dominican Republic to the United Kingdom, he presented his credentials to President Barack Obama as the current Dominican ambassador to the United States in July of 2011. Welcome to Yale, Mr. Ambassador. I also wanted to welcome the several members of the President's staff who are here with us for his Chubb Fellowship visit, including especially Yamile Eusebio, Director of the President's Global Foundation for Democracy and Development in New York. And is Yamile here? There we go. Finally, I want to express the special thanks of both Yale and the Chubb Fellowship Committee to the Dominican Students Association of Yale, and in particular, Patricio Brito, who has worked for over 2 years to find a way to bring President Fernandez to our campus. I might say that not only did Patricio's work result in a Chubb Fellowship recipient who is bringing us a remarkable experience in public life and an important message for our time regarding Latin America, but this afternoon in a meeting with the Dominican Students Association and also the Latino student organization Hispaniola, President Fernandez and officers and alumni of the association committed to an important series of joint exchanges among undergraduate and graduate students of Dominican heritage in the United States, and the work, especially in education, to which the President's Foundation is now committed. So now let me introduce briefly our distinguished Chubb Fellowship visiting speaker, President Leonel Fernandez, who this past summer stepped down from his third term of office as the elected president of the Dominican Republic. He was born there in 1953 and came to New York City at the age of 8, attending school in this country from 1962 until his return to the Dominican Republic in 1971. In 1978, he graduated from the Autonomous University of Santo Domingo with honors in law. He worked as a teacher and a journalist and also practiced law before entering politics as a follower and protege of the noted Dominican thinker, writer, and political leader Juan Bosch, founder of the Dominican Liberation Party. In 1996, as the presidential candidate for the party, Mr. Fernandez survived the first round of a heavily contested election and won the second round by a narrow margin. Elected at age 42, he is the youngest person ever to have served in the office. Mr. Fernandez vowed to end political corruption, implemented closer oversight of the judiciary, police, and military, and promised greater scrutiny of state-owned firms and reforms to strengthen manufacturing and agriculture. In 1999, he announced an initiative to broaden the country's economic base by attracting high-technology firms to the Dominican Republic. In 1998, he restored diplomatic relations with Cuba. Constitutionally barred from running for re-election, Mr. Fernandez left office in 2000. In 2004, however, he was returned to office by a wide margin, and he was re-elected to a third term in 2008. In 2011, Mr. Fernandez was pressured by some of his partisans to pursue the further amendment of the country's constitution to allow him to serve yet another consecutive term. He opposed the change to the Constitution and stepped down from office this past summer. Both in office and out, President Fernandez has sustained a focus on economic growth and financial stability as the keys to both political success and success of the nation. It is a fact that growth rates in the Dominican Republic during his terms of office have been among the very highest in Latin America. He has in addition paid sustained attention to education, to food security, to agricultural development, and to regional cooperation. As I have spent time with him over the last 2 days, I have noticed something in particular, and in particular in his speaking to students, both last night at the Chubb Fellowship dinner in Timothy Dwight College, and the students this afternoon from the Latino organizations at Yale. One thing I've noted is he's extraordinarily generous with his time and access to his person. I don't know how many students he greeted last night, but it felt like it was virtually all of them. Beyond that, he is what I, speaking as a philosopher, would call a pragmatist philosopher. And we think of pragmatism, generally speaking, in a kind of common everyday sense as getting things done. How do you get things done? You're a pragmatist. You're not an ideologue. You work to make the trains run. You get things done. However, that's not what pragmatism is as a philosophical movement. Philosophically speaking, pragmatism means that the doing is the learning. And I have heard him say this several times over the past 2 days to students, that you must get beyond your classrooms and you must actually be in contact with the work that you hope to engage in order to learn what it is that you are going to be doing. A deeply pragmatic perspective on education. However, I will say that at the very same time, he has shown an extraordinary intellectual curiosity, both in his description of how he got interested in politics and growing up, the self-taught intellectual culture that he inhabited, both in New York and in the Dominican Republic, and evidenced in even such things as when he arrived in town yesterday and I thought we'd all go out to lunch, he said, no, I'd actually like to go to the bookstore. And all of his staff know this. We talked about it with the students last night. We spent the next hour and a half, his first hour and a half in New Haven, in the Yale bookstore, and I think that the take at the end was about 60 to 80 books that he was taking back home to add to the 400,000 books that he has collected for his Foundation Institute and to accompany this afternoon's conversations with the students about intellectual exchanges, where he shows the other side of pragmatist philosophy, which is that the very exchange of ideas brings people together, gives them a common experience and a common vocabulary, and allows them to transmit practices and ideas and relationships from one context to the other. And it was in that modality that he was hoping that this visit to Yale would initiate exchanges between the Dominican and other Latino students here and what's happening in the Dominican Republic. So I would like you to welcome this deeply and philosophically pragmatic man, President Leonel Fernandez.
Thank you, Master Brenzel, for your very kind and warm introduction. And thank you for all the generosity that you've shown in the last 2 days. He even took me to a Cuban restaurant the first day I was here. Thank you a lot. It was very good. Thank you also for your presence, Ambassador Aníbal de Castro, and to all of you for being here today. Over 50 years ago, in his commencement speech here at Yale, President John F. Kennedy began by stating that he had the best of two worlds, a Harvard education and a Yale degree. Well, right from the beginning, I have to admit openly and honestly that I have not been so fortunate in experiencing the wonders of neither of those two academic worlds. Nonetheless, it is an honor and a privilege to be here today at this prestigious institution of higher learning, from where two prominent Latinos were educated, becoming, for many, a source of inspiration. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor and former Mexican President Ernesto Zedillo. I am also very pleased to know there is a group of young and talented Dominican students here at Yale who have organized themselves since 2005 in a very creative manner within the Dominican Student Association called Quisqueyalis. We have Quisqueya, it is the original name of our country, so they have mixed Quisqueya with Yale, calling themselves Quisqueyalis, right? Personally, I'm not only delighted to find a Dominican and Latino presence in this very vibrant intellectual environment, but also thrilled to share with you the news that even though a small nation, the Dominican Republic, my country, very recently gained a respected status as a world power in a particular field of interest and great following here in the US. Can you guess what? Baseball. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Dominican Republic, thank you. All right. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Dominican Republic, which can also be called Baseball Land, became the undefeated champion of the World Baseball Classic. And it is with that distinction and sense of national pride that I express my gratitude to Yale's authorities, faculty members, and students for inviting me to address you on the relevance of Latin America and the Caribbean in the 21st century. As you all know, Latin America and the Caribbean represent a region of 33 independent and sovereign states, extending from the Rio Grande, this is Texas and New Mexico, to the southern tip of South America, covering an area 2.5 times the size of the US. It accounts for nearly 4% of the Earth's surface and can be divided into several subregions, such as Mesoamerica, which includes Mexico and Central America, the Andeans and Southern Cone countries in South America and the Caribbean islands. At this moment, nearly 600 million people live in the area. In 1900, the population was made up of 60 million people. 50 years later, in 1950, it came up to 150 million people, which at that time equals the population of the United States. Since then, up till now, 60 years later, it has quadrupled and is almost the double of current US population. About 1/3 or 30% of Latin America's population is under 15 years of age. So it is a very young population. Great ethnic and demographic diversity characterizes the region. The people of Latin America represent a mixture of various racial groups, comprised of indigenous people, white Europeans, black Africans, Asians, and Arabs. Mexico, Central America, and the Andean regions in South America have the largest indigenous population, which makes up a larger part of the people living in Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, and Guatemala. Various languages are spoken: Spanish, Portuguese, French, English, Dutch, and over 30 different indigenous ones, including Quechua and Aymara. Latin America has the largest reserves of arable land in the world. It produces oil, metal, foodstuff. It has an impressive rich biodiversity and astonishing natural environments. The region is home to the Amazon rainforest, the Galapagos Islands in Ecuador, and the Andean glaciers. It accounts for 23% of the world's forests and 31% of its freshwater resources. It also houses approximately 70% of the world's species and almost 20% of its ecoregions. Brazil, the world's 5th largest country in area and population, has more environmental capital and more fresh water than any country in the world. The region has a combined GDP of $6.7 trillion at purchasing power parity. 3 of its major economies, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, are active members of the exclusive World Economic Elite G20 group. According to a report on economics and trade by the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, better known in Spanish as CEPAL, in 2012, the region is predicted to grow at 3.1% this last year, which is higher than the 2.2% of world economic growth. More precisely, the ECLAC report states that, and I quote, "The region's economic reforms of past decades, its fiscal and macroeconomic prudence, and its sound financial supervision, together with ever closer commercial ties with China and other emerging economies, have allowed it not only to successfully navigate through the worst international crisis of the past 80 years, but also to enter the new decade with a promising outlook for growth and advances in quality of life. And for the first time in its history, the region achieved during the past decade a combination of high growth, macroeconomic stability, poverty reduction, and improvement in income distribution. And with regard to global economic recovery, the region is today firmly part of the solution. It was not part of the original problem." End the quote. For this year, 2013, growth projection will heavily depend on the performance of the global economy. At this moment, the economic situation in the European Union is still gloomy. Recession persists in some of the larger economies in the region, and this will surely have an impact on the South American countries that have Europe as its major trading partner. Likewise, some of the emerging economies, like the BRICS, which includes Brazil, Russia, China, India, and now South Africa, have decelerated their growth. And all of this will also influence, on the short term, Latin American and Caribbean's economic performance. U.S. economy, regardless of being in a better shape than the European Union, is still fragile and has not fully recovered from the global economic meltdown. This has provoked a decrease of U.S. trade and investments in the region. Imports have dropped from 51% in 2000 to 33% in 2009, and exports fell from 60% to 39% during the same period. In past decades, President Kennedy's Alliance for Progress, President Bush Sr.'s Initiative for the Americas, and President Clinton's call for a Summit of the Americas were all visionary and strategic proposals designed to enhance trade and cooperation in the region. None of those exist today. Hence, there is a growing perception that the U.S. lacks a strategic vision towards the region. In order to reverse that, the U.S. will need a renewed set of policies to address the remaining priorities of its Latin American and Caribbean agenda, which includes issues of security, crime violence, repatriation of criminals, illegal drug trafficking, illegal weapons trade, human rights protection, labor rights, climate change, remittances, and migration. Yet the question, does Latin America and the Caribbean really matter, still looms out there. And in response, we have to say that the region is a place of enormous contrasts. It is not wealthy enough to become a state-of-the-art center for international financial transactions. It is not poor enough to provoke worldwide pity. It is not dangerous enough to generate global fear. So what is the importance of Latin America, and where does its major contribution lie? For a long time, it has been considered that it is in the realm of culture where Latin America and the Caribbean have made their mark and built their brand and reputation on a global scale. It has been through literature, music, dance, film, painting, and the arts in general where Latin American soul has been discovered. Who has not been touched by Gabriel García Márquez' Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude, Mario Vargas Llosa's La Fiesta del Chivo, about the Dominican Republic's dictatorship Trujillo, the Feast of the Goat, or the poems by the Chilean Nobel Prize winner Pablo Neruda, 20 poemas de amor y una canción desesperada. What about admiring the widely recognized artistic movements like muralism, muralismo, which began in Mexico, represented by such outstanding figures as Diego Rivera, David Alfaro Siqueiros, y José Clemente Orozco, or the paintings of Frida Kahlo, one of the most distinguished Latin American artists of all times, who had a style that combined realism, symbolism, and surrealism. Who has not jumped from his or her seat at the sound of merengue, salsa, bachata, vallenato, or reggaeton? Who has not laughed over the years with Cantinflas movies, or sensed the emotions of Colombian soap operas like Betty La Fea, Ugly Betty? In addition to this notorious cultural presence in the world, for the last 3 decades, given the enormous demographic, economic, social, and political transformations that have been taking place in the region, Latin America and the Caribbean has emerged as a key player in global affairs, one that needs to be watched closely. Due to the implementation of sound social policies, life expectancy has increased from 71 years of age in 2000 to 74 years of age now in 2012. Child mortality has decreased significantly in the last 10 years. Unemployment has dropped from 9% in 2005 to 6.4% in 2012. Poverty and extreme poverty have fallen as well, from 48% in 1990 to 28.8% in 2012. All this has resulted in an increase of the Human Development Index and the expansion of a new, more sophisticated, global-oriented middle class in the different countries in the region. Through great efforts and innovative programs, illiteracy has been seriously addressed for the first time in the region's history. Access to education has broadened, making it available to almost everyone, regardless of distance and social conditions. Teacher training programs and salary increases have been materialized. New technologies have been introduced at all academic levels, rising the efficiency, content, and quality of education, even though there is still much to be done in that field. In terms of infrastructure development, the changes in nearly every country in Latin America and the Caribbean have been astounding and breathtaking. The skylines in major cities have been replaced with new buildings constructed with steel and glass, thus resembling the modern view of developed countries. That can be fully appreciated in cities like Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Panama City, Bogotá, Santiago de Chile, Buenos Aires, and of course, Santo Domingo. Major improvements have been achieved in paving roads, providing fresh water, building homes for the poor and middle class, erecting schools and hospitals, constructing subway systems, and promoting access to new information and communications technologies. Internet in Latin America and the Caribbean is in continuous growth. At this moment, there are more than 255 million users, which is nearly half the region's population. As the World Bank established in a recent report, the region also leads in global mobile growth. with almost 660 million mobile telephones in use. That represents a density of 107 cellular devices for every 100 residents. That means there are more phones than people in Latin America today. Nowadays, Latin America and the Caribbean nations have become urban, modern societies. More than 81% of the population lives in cities, which was exactly the opposite 50 years ago. And many economic activities have also shifted into a more service-oriented economy. So there is an undeniable sense of progress, social change, and modernization taking place around the region, and the only question or sense of uncertainty relating to its future is about its long-term sustainability. And in order to become sustainable and competitive in the 21st century, the Latin American and Caribbean nations must be able to move forward with an agenda to improve the quality of education, promote science and technology, enhance innovation, diversify their economies, increase productivity, and integrate within the global chain of production. Moving now towards a more sensitive area, if I may, I know that due to President Hugo Chávez's recent passing and upcoming presidential election scheduled for next Sunday in Venezuela, there is some concern, especially here in the US, about the strength and viability of democracy in the region and about the political meaning and role of what has been identified as the new Latin American left. One must remember that from some 200 years ago, since achieving their independence, the Latin American and Caribbean nations always aspired to install democracy within their respective societies. But for different historical reasons, with only very few exceptions, these aspirations were not fulfilled during the 19th or the first half of the 20th century. And it was only after the end of the Second World War that a swing of the pendulum in favor of democracy began to take place in countries like Guatemala and Venezuela. However, soon this swing began to reverse. In Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz nationalized United Fruit Company, an American corporation, and soon after, the US government intervened, toppling Arbenz on the grounds of being pro-communist. The Cold War influence in blurring the differences among US government officials between nationalistic policies and communism. The Truman Doctrine, or policy of containment, clouded the vision of various US administrations in dealing with the issue of nationalism and not making the mistake of confusing it with communism. Even Fidel Castro, in 1952, was running to become a member of the Chamber of Deputies, representing the province of Havana, when Fulgencio Batista led the coup that derailed Cuba from its democratic path. During its first stage, after 1959, the Cuban Revolution was not a socialist revolution, but a nationalist one. It appeals not to Karl Marx or to Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, but more to José Martí, Antonio Maceo, and Máximo Gómez. But Castro had nationalized, as Arbenz did before him, American corporate interests. And as a reaction to that, the invasion of pigs, which was oriented towards overthrowing his regime, failed. It was only after that episode in 1961 that the Cuban Revolution aligned itself with the Soviet Union, thus becoming a major player in the Cold War drama. My own country, the Dominican Republic, is a clear historical example of confusion created among US policymakers between nationalism and communism when President Johnson ordered a military occupation of the small island nation to prevent it from becoming a second Cuba. What really was at stake in the Dominican Republic in 1965 had nothing to do with a country becoming a second Cuba. It was about the return to democracy and constitutional order and the reposition of Juan Bosch to the presidency, who had been overthrown by a military coup d'etat in 1963 after winning in a landslide the first democratic elections that took place in the country after the fall of the Trujillo dictatorship. But exactly the opposite occurred in neighboring Haiti, where President Clinton, authorized by UN Council resolution, ordered the deployment of US troops to remove the military regime installed in 1991 by a coup d'etat and restore the elected president Jean-Bertrand Aristide back into office to end his term. What made the difference in terms of decision-making in these similar cases between the Dominican Republic and Haiti was one main and single factor, the Cold War, which divided the world in two different lines of thought and political behavior. With the end of that historical period, the Red Scare disappeared, and with it the fear that a communist takeover might deviate any democratic political process. It has been only during the last 3 decades that democracy has been fully established in Latin America and the Caribbean. According to recent polls taken by a highly recognized firm, Latino Barometro, at this moment there is a high appreciation in the region of what democracy has brought to different nations in terms of respect for human rights, free and fair elections, freedom of the press, independence of the judiciary, the respect for the rule of law, and government accountability. With the flourishing of democracy in the region, organizations that were originally involved in armed revolutionary struggle have put down their arms and integrated themselves within the democratic process to participate through the electoral system as a way of having access to power. This is the case, just to mention 3 examples, of the Frente Farabundo Martí de Liberación Nacional in El Salvador, Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional in Nicaragua, Frente Amplio in Uruguay, all of which, after many years of political arms confrontation, have won national elections in a fairly manner and now rule their countries through democratic means. During the Cold War, the left-wing movement in Latin America or any other part of the world was engaged in a process of bringing down capitalism as a system. This is not the case in Latin America today. No elected government in the region is even remotely considering overturning the capitalist system. Nowadays, left-wing politics in Latin America is more concerned with challenging what is called the orthodox free market philosophy, identified as the Washington Consensus and the flaws and disparities emerging from globalization. The Washington Consensus was essentially a response to the macroeconomic crisis that affected Latin America and the Caribbean in the 80s. It focused mainly on market stabilization, trade and privatization, and ignored the social issues of poverty, unemployment, and social inequality. This lack of human or social element, labeled as a market-centered neoliberal approach, generated the conditions for its rejection in different parts of the region, creating the breeding ground for the return of state-centric policies in Latin America. With different characteristics, national conditions, international styles, and personal leadership styles, it is this view of economic and social development centered on the state instead of the market which has been considered as a swing to the left in Latin America and the Caribbean. Other elements that have also contributed to these images of Latin America leaning towards the left have been the fact that some elected heads of state come from the indigenous movement, the labor unions, the progressive military, or feminist groups, such as Evo Morales, Luis Ignacio da Silva Lula, Dilma Rousseff, and Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. Therefore, at this pivotal moment, more than the left as a dominant force, it is fair to indicate that 2 opposing economic, political, and social views pervade Latin America and the Caribbean: neoliberalism and neopopulism. The future of democracy in the region will depend upon our ability to overcome these 2 distinct and contrasting paradigms. Instead of being too much focused on the left or the right, what the region needs is a new set of policies that can balance the role of state with that of the market. What is also needed at this moment in Latin America and the Caribbean is the capacity to integrate market forces with social policies upheld by a culture of solidarity, cooperation, and partnership for development. At the beginning of this second decade of the 21st century, what Latin America needs is more and better democracy, more sustainable economic growth, preservation of the environment and natural resources, more jobs, better quality education and healthcare, and widespread prosperity and opportunity for all. If you allow me, I would like to conclude by briefly referring to the Latino community in the US. And as indicated by the Census Bureau, as of 2012, there are 52 million Latinos living in this great nation, making it the largest ethnic or race minority at this moment. They constitute 16.7% of the US total population, and the projections are that by 2050, will account for 132 million inhabitants, representing 30% of US total population. Latinos will continue entering the workforce in growing numbers. In 2011, it reached 15% of the total US labor force, and by 2050, it is expected to be at the level of 24%. In the last 15 years, there has been a 53% increase of the total number of Latinos serving in elected office, which demonstrate their growing political influence at the government level. Many Latinos have distinguished themselves in the arts, academia, business, politics, and diverse professional activities. Names such as Jennifer Lopez, better known as J-Lo, Mark Anthony, Carlos Santana, Gloria Estefan, Salma Hayek, Zoe Saldaña, A-Rod. His real name is Alex Rodriguez, but he changed it for A-Rod. And Juno Diaz, just to name a few, are very familiar and quite popular around the nation, which makes us all Latin Americans very proud of them. The Latino community represents a great force in the US, as can be proven with the fact that they have a purchasing power of $1.5 trillion a year within the US market, but also through the results of the last presidential elections in which it became decisive in the outcome. Latinos made their mark on election day as they voted for President Barack Obama's re-election over Republican candidate Mitt Romney, 71% to 27%. And they were instrumental in helping President Obama win in two of the key battleground states, Nevada, 70 to 25%, and Colorado, 75 to 23%. In Spanish, we say, Obama le dio una pela. Taking into account the electoral results, Republican strategy and CNN contributor Ana Navarro, who was the national Latino co-chair of McCain's presidential campaign, stated, quote, "If we don't do better with Hispanics, we'll be out of the White House forever." Noting the importance of Latinos, President Obama said, quote, "Our country was built on and continues to thrive on its diversity, and there is no doubt that the future of the United States is inextricably linked to the future of the Hispanic community." Beyond question, Latin America's influence has expanded at such length around the globe that it has recently reached the unreachable dream, a Latin American Pope, El Papa Francisco, sitting on the chair of St. Peter in the heart of the Vatican. Thank you very much.
If you'd like to ask a question, we've got some students with microphones. Just raise your hand. The president will call on you and wait for a microphone to get to you. Questions? It's an unusually shy audience.
Either everybody was convinced or I bored everybody here. Right?
Mr. President, I have a question that is related to last night's talk, which was aimed at more of the undergraduate students in Timothy Dwight. You talked about your college experience in Dominican Republic, and it was more or less based on a political affiliation. Can you elaborate on how that plays out for an 18 or 20-year-old, versus the way the average Yalie, goes, or the average American goes to college? I was here in the 70s, and it was
Yes.
more like that then here. But now it doesn't seem to be particularly tied to your political beliefs. Your road through college, it's not that big a deal. But obviously it was in your day in the Dominican Republic.
Well, there is a conventional wisdom that you tend to learn only through academic institutions. And even though you get an opportunity to really grow intellectually and professionally through academic institutions, there are other ways of learning too, beyond academic institutions. And it was the case in the Dominican Republic when I returned at the end of the 60s, beginning the 70s. And it had to do with national conditions and what was taking place around the world. The people of my generation became very interested, for example, in what was going on in Vietnam, U.S. policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean, the consequences of the U.S. military occupation in the Dominican Republic in '65. So there was a generation that was intellectually curious and that needed to participate actively in politics in order to contribute to a social change in our country. So that created an intellectual environment, even at the neighborhood level, where college students were self-taught. They were reading things that were not assigned in schools, but it's just because they were interested and they thought this will be intellectual tools for opening up their minds and understanding what was going on in the world. And so when I returned to the Dominican Republic, I was caught up within that political and environment situation, and I think it somehow influenced me, in my world outlook. Now, of course, there's another factor. I mentioned Juan Bosch, a former president and the most prolific and prestigious Dominican intellectual of all times. He returned from exile at the beginning of 1970 and began having daily lectures by radio, a little bit like FDR here during the Great Depression. But he was a great lecturer, a great thinker, and he was also very influential in shaping my generation. So in him, we found a mentor. First, very remote. I mean, he was already a well-known Latin American intellectual, so it was very difficult to have access to him. But later on, we did, and we established a personal relationship with him. And we learned reading his books, and we learned listening to his lectures and through his leadership style. So there was also a mentoring from a great figure that gave us a sense of orientation, because we're reading many things, but that didn't have like a goal or an objective. Now, when Juan Bosch came and he made us become aware of the wealth of our national culture, our national history, and the need to move forward and establish democracy, well, then that gave us a sense of orientation, a sense of direction. And that's how I really got involved, participating through politics and learning through politics different ideas and different things. Because perhaps the idea that one has is being involved in politics is only a struggle for power. It is not true. Through politics, you develop many skills that otherwise you wouldn't have it. Public speaking skills, organizational skills, influencing people, mobilizing people. You only learn that because you participate. And through participation, there's a learning curve that will transform you as an individual to become really influential within your society, within your neighborhood, within your peers. And I think this is the experience that I had in the Dominican Republic. Another thing one learns is everybody has a mentor at some point in life. And later on, you become a mentor to someone else. So there's like a chain of events there.
I'd like to exercise chair's privilege to ask one question.
Yes.
Which is, you presented a compelling, I thought, array of factors on which the region has made consistent and considerable progress over the past 2 decades. Democratization,
Yes.
Economic growth, even relative to other parts of the world, reduction of poverty, diversification of economies, even the growth of the Latino population of the United States and the implications that that has for perhaps a greater region here. What's your center of anxiety? What do you see as perhaps the single greatest challenge or the thing that you would worry about most that could stop or reverse some of that progress?
This is interesting because we have been celebrating since 2008 in Latin America and the Caribbean the 200th anniversary of independence. And as I said, right from its beginnings, there was an aspiration in the region to install democracy and promote economic growth and create opportunities. It never really happened, with the exceptions of a few countries. So what really has taken place in the last 30 plus years to generate this political, economic, and social transformation in Latin America? It will be a mistake to look at it only from a Latin American perspective. I think it has to do with everything that has been taking place in the world. The democratization process didn't even begin in Latin America. It began in Southern Europe at the end of the 70s. It came with the collapse of the Salazar regime in Portugal, with the end of Francisco Franco's regime in Spain, or the military in Greece. Many Latin American politicians and intellectuals were living in Europe at that time. They were influenced by these events. And so when they came back to their respective countries, they changed their political strategy, which at that time was confronting dictatorship with socialism. And then they figured out that it was more difficult to confront authoritarian regimes presenting an alternative to the system. And instead they said, instead of dictatorship versus socialism, or as they framed it at the time, fascism versus socialism, it was more dictatorship versus democracy. So there was a change in the mindset in Latin American intellectuals and politicians, for the first time accepting democracy in modern times, because democracy was disdained at some point, because every time there was an attempt to install democracy, there would be a military coup d'etat, and perhaps US government officials aligned themselves with the new dictators. There was a lot of frustration with democracy in Latin America. And some would say bourgeois democracy, or lamentada representativa, that mentioned representative system. But after that, after what happened in Southern Europe, there was a new mindset. With that, I think there are two other factors that play an important influence in this transformation from dictatorships to democracy. There's a man that I think has not been given enough credit for everything he did in allowing this transition to democracy in Latin America, and that is President Jimmy Carter. With his human rights policy and pressing for free and fair elections at the end of the 70s, Jimmy Carter really made an important contribution to political change in Latin America. The other have to do with social democracy in Europe. They have an organization called Socialist International, which is not Marxist, is more democratic-oriented, and they had an opening for Latin America, and then traditional populist Latin American parties became part of this organization. And so coming from Europe and coming from the US, there was a lot of pressure to organize democratic elections, free and fair elections. And beginning in the Dominican Republic in 1978, there has been a third wave of democratization after the Second World War, and for the first time, there has been no reverse in this situation. So in Latin America, we all think that democracy has come to stay, and that we are more now consolidating democracy and working on how government can be more efficient, how can it be more transparent, how can it be more accountable, how can it deliver what the people is expecting from a government than ever before. This never took place before. So having resolved the political question of stability, of how do you have access to power, you can even consider what I said in my previous remarks. Organizations like El Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, which came to power in 1979 through an armed struggle, lost elections 10 years later, and came back to power again through electoral means. So everybody has accepted the rules of the game, that it is through free and fair elections that you have access to power. Now, for the population, that is a great achievement, but not enough, because at the end of the game, at the end of what you are making as a proposal, what is the economic and social evolution of society? And there have been many reforms. The Washington Consensus, I think, has a merit in that it corrected some of the problems of the previous economic model, which was more Keynesian, in the sense that it emphasized macroeconomic stability. It emphasized fiscal deficits correction, combating hyperinflation. So all these things were good, but still not enough because they didn't have an impact in the well-being of the population. So what has been questioned on the Washington Consensus, it is that it's too technocratic, and it forgot what policymaking is all about, is having people as the targeted element to which you have to influence. So going beyond the Washington Consensus, the new governments in Latin America have installed social policies. The whole idea that if the economy grows, it will trickle down and have an impact is being rejected in Latin America, and you have to combine solid macroeconomic policies, economic growth, with active social policies aimed at improving the quality of people. This combination has made the difference in Latin America. With economic growth, governments now have had resources to invest in infrastructure development, which means better schools, better hospitals, better roads. This transformation has been because of that. Now, looking forward, once again, the region is not isolated. It is part of what is taking place on a global scale. Much of the success in the last decade has been that southern countries, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Argentina, have had close trade links with China. China has made an inroad within Latin America and the Caribbean. And I would say South America at this moment is more connected with China in Asia than ever before. Now, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean are more integrated with the U.S. economy. The Dominican Republic is more integrated with the U.S., and of course it has to do with geography, is the geographical proximity that we have with the U.S. It also has to do with the presence of a population here. Central America and the Caribbean islands have a Latino diaspora that connects with the U.S. and their respective countries, is less South America, which always had more close relationship with the European countries than with the U.S. So if there is a deceleration of economic growth in China, for example, or in Asia, these countries will be hurt because their exports have been going to China. If China demands less copper and less zinc and less foodstuff, so their economies will drop. And we already can see that. China was growing 12% a year. This past year decelerated to 7%. And now the Brazilian economy is only growing 1.5% in 2012. So we depend on that. The future of Latin America then, first of all, will depend on how the global economy performs. If the US economy picks up again and you can have 2.5, 3% growth, that will have a tremendous impact in Latin America, especially in Mexico. If the US economy starts booming up again, it will pick up on Mexico that is poised to be also a country with a great potential for economic growth and sustainability in the years to come. If Europe can get out of its current recession, it will also have an impact in Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, on the domestic side, we have had a decade of great success, but also we have some challenges. The question of sustainability. The question of sustainability for Latin American and Caribbean economy has to do with the fact that we have been exporting raw materials. We have been exporting natural resources with no productive transformation. So the real thing now is, how can we add value to our products and services? How can we be part of a global chain of production? And that can only be done through knowledge. So the quality of education is key. Improving our universities. We're very preoccupied with the standard of our universities in Latin America and the Caribbean. When you see university rankings, world university rankings, the first one that appears in the ranking from Latin America and the Caribbean is La Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, UNAM, and it figures out number 200. Number 200. And then after that, Sao Paulo is there, Universidad Federativa de Rio de Janeiro, but all after the 200. So we're not competing internationally in terms of producing knowledge and generating new patents to be registered, intellectual property rights. We're lagging there. So Latin America needs a policy for science, technology, and innovation. We need to protect our indigenous knowledge with new intellectual property rights. This is the way to move forward, and for that we need public-private partnerships in order to invest in innovation and technology and science. We need to create a culture of science. In Latin America, over the years, we have been promoting soft science. Everybody studies law, or studies marketing, or studies management, soft science. Now we need engineers. We need scientists that can put all their knowledge in place and really make this transformative production of our raw materials into new goods and services. If we're able to improve the quality of education, to innovate, to integrate within the global economy, then I think Latin America will become a major key player in global affairs.
You ended your speech speaking about Latinos in America,
Yes.
Which is a growing population, huge. And you talked a little bit about the 16.7% of the population is Latino here. Fortune 500 company CEOs is only 1.7%. I have 6 CEOs for the Fortune 500. What steps outside of education and mentorship, because there's very few mentors, because not a lot of people that are in that position, but what other steps can we take to bridge that gap of that, you know?
I think that is the main road ahead, is education. It has to do with innovation, with vision forward, and creating some sort of Latino organizations that already exist, and supporting each other, and coming out with new ventures, coming out with new fresh ideas that will have an impact in the US. So, but the key to everything has to do with education. And perhaps we're not there as CEOs in those Fortune 500 companies, because there is still now some gap in terms of knowledge between the Latino community and other communities here in the US. I will always emphasize the role of education to move up the ladder. You can see that. For example, you have Sonia Sotomayor coming out, a graduate from Yale. But coming from Yale, she makes it to the Supreme Court, you see? So it's education at the end. At the bottom of everything is education.
Mr. President, good afternoon, Mr. President. Talking about the future of Latin America, how do you foresee the strengthening of regional groups to participate as a bloc in the global economy? The GDP of El Salvador is not the same as in Argentina, or the GDP of Jamaica is not the same as Brazil. And thus, our economies are growing because of the demand of resources from China. The resources that we held in our lands, arable land, potable water, precious metals, non-precious metals, are going to be demanded in the future from Europe, from the United States, and other parts of the world. So wouldn't Latin America benefit from a cohesive union, a group such as UNASUR, but at much larger scale? Don't you foresee the regional grouping Latin American countries will benefit the region as a whole? Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree. There is an integration process taking place in Latin America at different levels. It has always existed at sub-regional levels. The Caribbean countries, for example, are within CARICOM. If you add Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Cuba, it's called CARIFORUM, and they use it as a platform to negotiate with the European Union. Then you have in Central America, SICA, Sistema de Integración Centroamérica, is also integration. If you add Mexico to Central America, it's called Mesoamerica, and they also negotiate. And in South America, you have the Andean Pact, El Pacto Andino, and then you have Mercosur in the south, and now they have created UNASUR. The problem is that we have too many organizations that are overlapping each one with the other. Politically, we have created something new that I hope it can work. It's called CELAC, Comunidad de Estados de América Latina y el Caribe. And CELAC is supposed to be one voice representing political dialogue, Latin America with the rest of the world. What's lacking is that it's not a formalized institution. The chair changes every year from one country to the other. So I think perhaps we have to work more on that to have a one-voice representative of Latin America. I'll give you an example. We have 3 countries, as I mentioned before, Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina, that are members of the G20 group. How proud are we as Latin Americans to have 3 countries that are in that elite club? Nevertheless, when they go to those meetings, they go with their own agenda. They don't represent Latin America and the Caribbean. We hope that within CELAC, we can get together and design a policy that will represent the interests of all Latin America. That doesn't exist until now. So there is, I see the idea of integrating, the idea of cooperation, South-South cooperation, creating new institutions, for example, financial institutions that will finance projects in Latin America with, I would say, conditions that are not within the commercial banks. These kinds of things are interesting. Also, in the energy sector, for example. You can have it in educational exchange within Latin American countries. So these are all new initiatives that we did not have before. The idea of cooperation, the idea of solidarity, the idea of coming together is something also new in the region that is enhancing our possibilities of increasing our economic growth and social well-being.
Señor Presidente, it is a real honor to have you here at Yale, so thank you for being here, and thanks for all the Dominicans who are here visiting as well. I would like to invite you to discuss a little bit more the conflict you noted between neoliberalism and neopopulism. I'm particularly interested in how you view this translating into global trade dynamics and what types of trade agreements Latin American and Caribbean countries, and specifically Dominican Republic, if you wish to comment on that, would view as advantageous. For example, one might associate neoliberalism with the incredible rise in bilateral investment treaties that we saw in the 90s and early 2000, the multilateral trade agreements such as DR-CAFTA and NAFTA, and now in more recent years with, one might say, the neopopulism rise in Latin America, we see at least 2, if not 3 Latin American countries rejecting and challenging ICSID, the World Bank dispute resolution framework for investment state treaty disputes. And we see South Africa, which obviously not part of the region, but a notable actor who, as I understand it, has called for an end to entering into bilateral investment treaties. So how does this all translate into what types of agreements are Latin American countries and Caribbean countries in particular rethinking as advantageous to its own interests, and how do you equate that with this neo-populism, neoliberalism divide that you've noted?
Okay. I think there's a combination of different elements here. No? It has to do with political ideology, it has to do with economic interests, and also with a particular moment in history, in current and contemporary history. For example, looking from the trade side, we had in Latin America, in the Caribbean more specifically, what was called the Caribbean Basin Initiative, okay, or CBI. With CBI, all the Caribbean countries were allowed to export their goods and services into the US market on a duty-free basis, unilaterally, with the exception of Nicaragua and Cuba, excluded for ideological political reasons at the time. But the thing is that there was an incentive to export within the largest market in the world, which is the US market, unilaterally. This was done to help the Caribbean countries overcome their internal problems and somehow to stop massive illegal migration coming from the Caribbean into the US. This was the logic of all this. Now, after the end of the Cold War, a unilateral free trade access into the US market coming from the Caribbean becomes a reciprocal free trade treaty between the Caribbean and the United States. And this creates a problem in the sense that we're dealing with an economy of scale, which would be the US economy, with very small poverty-ridden economies in the Caribbean. And this sense of asymmetry or disparity, how can it be tackled? And of course, there is no answer to that. And I'll just give you an example. I think I talked to with the students yesterday about Haiti, for you to understand. Haitian workers produce rice in the Dominican Republic, but they don't do it in Haiti. Why not? Because Haiti imports all its rice from Arkansas, which is subsidized by the local government, the production and the export. So it's cheaper for Haiti to import rice subsidized rice from Arkansas than to produce it themselves. So in that case, it is very difficult to have real free trade when there is a disparity or asymmetry between two different scale of economies. This is a problem for the future, because even though it has been considered gradually that the economy will open gradually to the import of US goods and services, also Europe, because we have signed free trade agreements with Europe. It will take 20, 25 years, they say, to have fully opened the markets to the imports of goods and services. But even then, in 25 years from now, many of our productive sectors will be harmed by the opening up of these markets. So this is something that's still pending that we have to work on and see exactly how we can benefit our population back in the Caribbean. Finally, on neoliberalism and neopopulism. I think at the center stage of political, philosophical debate worldwide is the relationship between state and market. It is a relationship between a conservative movement, which thinks that markets should by themselves determine the outcome and performance of societies in every aspect, that markets are self-regulating, even though what happens with the recent global financial crisis proves that markets are not self-regulating, and those that have gone to the other extreme to think that the state should play the pivotal role in any decision-making that is required by the economic sector or by society. We called those that have made the faith and the market as the only solution to every problem, the neoliberal proposal. And the other, which has a state-centric solution to everything, is a neo-populist. The idea is that both are needed. You need a market to operate, but you also need a strong government to intervene on on specific occasions in order to guarantee some sort of equilibrium, social equilibrium within society, that you do through your tax system. So the combination of state and market will give us a new paradigm, going beyond neoliberalism and neopopulism. There are positive things in both. I mean, you cannot condemn and reject everything that comes from a liberal view or conservative view. Clinton here in the US took some ideas from the Reagan movement. Tony Blair in the UK took some ideas from Margaret Thatcher. He came into the center. If you are able to balance the relationship between state and market, you might become more effective in really satisfying people's needs in terms of opportunities and growth and et cetera. So this is what I think. It's not only Latin America, it's worldwide, this debate about the role of the state in the market.
I think we're going to have time for one more question, so let's make it a really terrific one. Was on.
I think there's a question over here.
Be confident.
Right. There's a question.
Mr. President?
Yes.
I have a two-part question. The first is, I wonder whether you can comment on the drug problem in Latin America and any solutions you might think of. And the second part is, do you like bachata music?
All right. I'll respond the last one, which is easier. Of course I do. Bachata. And the first one, I think, is one of the most challenging problems we're having in Latin America and the Caribbean right now, the drug trafficking issue and violence related to drug trafficking. And the only way I think this can be addressed is through a partnership between the US and our countries back home. There has been, at some points, a marked interest in building up on this partnership. But nevertheless, I think much more can be done. Over more than 20 years of addressing this issue with a certain perspective, it has not worked out. I think a new set of fresh ideas must be put in place. There is a need to enhance the dialogue between Latin America and the US and how to tackle this problem. Now, yesterday in the press, I read something that really concerned me. That is taking place here in the US, because from Latin America, we have the supply side. In the US, we have the demand side of this market. Yesterday in USA Today, I read that a group of young businessmen were creating a corporation equity investment to buy off some companies and from there purchase marijuana in the US, which will be legalized in many states. So when you think that there is a group already of people thinking here and doing business and making profit out of selling marijuana, it might indicate that there is a trend to the legalization of drugs for business purposes and profit making, which I think would be a wrong thing to do. I think drugs is not alcohol. We all know that drugs has an impact on people's brains and people's behavior. It also has a health issue, health care issue. It's not only the business side or the criminal side of it. It has to do with people's behavior, people's attitudes, people's way of relating to each other in society. So it's still a problem. It has not been addressed effectively. When you look at the way the terrorist issue is being dealt with, and you look at the way the drug lords are being treated, there is a difference. I think we have to look at the drug lords and the terrorists the same way, because they represent both a threat to the well-being and stability of our societies. And I don't think they are looking at the problem the same way.
Okay, so Mr. President, so a lot of your focus is on education. And relating to a question that was asked earlier about like the Fortune 500 and the representation of Latinos. Latinos aren't represented in a majority of the high-profile positions, and as you said, this relates to education. Latinos here in the United States have the highest dropout rate of any ethnic or racial group. And so a lot of that, there are many factors going into that, economics, social class, but part of it does have to do with the discrepancy between education here in the United States and in the home countries. So since the US population of Latinos is going to increase so much in the future, this is obviously of importance to both the US and to Latin America. So in what ways do you think Latin America can improve on its education?
What you see now, Latinos within the US making progress in some sense, no? Even though still when you look at the statistics, they're below some other groups. It has to do with the way, no, a wave of migration came into this country. The group that has traditionally migrated are those that are underclass in Latin America and the Caribbean. Those are the poor who have migrated into the US. So it has taken them a while to get integrated within a modern society as the US society. You have to learn a new language, you have to learn a new culture, you have to be part of the system in order to really participate. So it has taken, I would say, 30, 40 years for our people to be part of the American dream, to be part of the American system. Now, a second and third generation has born in the US. I think it's your case. And look what is happening. Now we have Dominicans at Yale University. You would have never thought about having Latinos or Dominicans at Yale University 20, 25 years ago. It was impossible. Now you're here, and Master Brenzel, and if in the years to come, these Dominicans most likely will be deans and masters here at Yale University because of your, I would say, your innovative spirit, and your capacity to work. So looking into the future, we'll have a new generation of American-born Latinos, which will have a great command of the English language, will be bicultural from the beginning, and will have more opportunities and access in this society to move up the ladder. So the future of Latinos in the US is much brighter than what has been up until now, because new opportunities will come to them. It is already happening. I mean, just think of the idea that we have a Latino justice at the Supreme Court. Just think of the idea that when President Obama addressed the State of the Union address, who responded him? A Latino from the Republican Party, Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida. And now the Republicans are thinking to put a Latino on the electoral ticket in 2016 to compete with the Democratic Party. So the Latinos are really moving up there. They're being considered an important sector in US. But I insist, in order to really make a mark and really to move on as a community, as families, as individuals, as communities, the key to success is education. Back in our countries, also the main target, the main objective is how can we improve education? Because as I said in my remarks, we have nowadays improved access to education. In the Dominican Republic, there is 99% access to education. The problem is not access anymore. The problem is the quality of education. Then it has to do with teacher training programs, the use of new technologies, the idea of learning a new language, of becoming digital literate, of having a global outlook, because nowadays you need to have a global outlook. It's not only your country, because you will be interacting with different parts of the world. Doing it with limited resources, as we have had in Latin America, makes it more difficult. But if we have a Latino diaspora that it is interacting with their respective countries, that makes it easier. I come to Yale, I talk to a group of students here, and everybody is excited on the possibility of connecting with students from the Dominican Republic in different exchange programs. Now, can you imagine a student from Universidad Autónoma de Santo Domingo coming for a seminar or a workshop at Yale University? This is a major revolution for him. He will connect with professors, new reading lists, students that will open up their minds with new ways of thinking. So when they go back with new tools, new ways of thinking, new ways of doing that will revolutionize things. This is why I think the best way to really make an impact in terms of economic development is through exchange of ideas. You never know exactly how you touch a person, how you change a person's lives just by the sole fact of exchanging ideas and opinions. So I believe in that, and by having you here, the Dominican Students Association and the Latinos Association, there's a great wealth of opportunities for exchange and really continuing this path of social transformation in our countries in Latin America and the Latino community here in the U.S. Right?
Mr. President, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
That's
Mr.
terrific. Thank you for coming today. I think maybe the president will be able to shake a few hands here for a few minutes, but then we have to get him to another place. Good evening, good luck. Enjoy the warm weather. He brought it in from Santo Domingo.